From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
I have always loved scary movies my entire life, and by extension, I've always loved the spooky and the strange and the things that are weird and found in the fringe. Obviously, I have this podcast. If you also love scary movies, then you probably also have your favorite list of films. In fact, every Halloween, there are always publications that put out their top 10 best horror movies, or I've even seen lists as large as 100. I, too, have my list, and the number one spot has remained unchanged since the time I sat down to make it. For the horror enthusiasts out there, you'll be very familiar with my number one, the movie The Exorcist, which is almost always in the top 5 of everyone's list, just because it's one of the few horror movies with an A-list cast, a great script, and brilliant execution. I mean, how many horror movies have been nominated for the highest awards in the business? The Exorcist back in the day was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, and actually won for Best Screenplay and Best Sound, and also nominated for 7 Golden Globes, and won for Best Motion Picture, Best Supporting Actress for the young Linda Blair, Best Director for William Friedkin, and Best Screenplay for author William Peter Blatty. When the movie hit theaters in 1973, people lined up around the block to see it. Theater goers fainted. Those who didn't faint either loved it or screamed and fled the theater. It was something more than just a horror film. It was a social commentary, a cultural phenomenon. Something no one had ever seen before and probably haven't seen since. It was so shocking to some that the Roman Catholic Church saw an uptick in new converts. And the fact that the novel the film is based on by author William Peter Blatty was based on an alleged true story is also fascinating. And that played into the tug-of-war that occurred during the making of the film between Blatty and the director William Friedkin, who was less of a believer but was captivated by the story. The movie works so well because it's not just a horror movie reliant on jump scares like so many modern horror movies. Sure, it's got its gore moments, but it's so much deeper, playing on the role of a mother dealing with a young woman going through the inevitable changes brought on by puberty, but also ties in religion and the fear of things that you cannot see. Through much of the movie, there is no real soundtrack, and as a result, your ears start to pick up on the most subtle sounds, putting you in a state of hyper-awareness. And in the end, there isn't really a happy ending. This movie pulls no punches. As of the release of this podcast, we're mere weeks removed from the 50th anniversary of the release of The Exorcist. So in celebration of my favorite horror film, I spoke with writer, producer, journalist, and Hugo and Locus Award-nominated author of more than 24 books about filmmakers and film history to talk about all things The Exorcist. So welcome to this week's mystery, The Exorcist with Nat Segaloff on From the Void. No, I appreciate you taking the time out to do this. On the topic of probably my favorite horror movie of all time. So,
oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah. So I was excited when I found your book. I thought, oh man, because there's so much, there's so many layers to it, and the individuals involved were some interesting characters to begin with, like Friedkin, and was kind of an odd guy. So. But why don't we start at the beginning? I should probably introduce you. So, and make sure, correct me if I'm saying this wrong. Is it Segaloff?
Yes, with an A sound.
Okay, perfect. So, welcome to the podcast, and again, for folks joining, this will go out obviously later. But for folks who are listening at some point in the future, we are here to talk about your book about, and I had no idea, by the way, it was the 50th anniversary of the movie The Exorcist, my favorite. I still think it's probably, to me, still holds up as probably the most terrifying movie ever made. So what got you into, first of all, writing a book about The Exorcist in the first place? How did that come about?
My stock joke is that I've been possessed by The Exorcist for 50 years. Once we get past that, I was a local press agent in Boston when The Exorcist opened, and my job because we had arranged a day before screening. Mr. Friedkin gave us the permission to show it to the press the day before opening. My job was not to see the movie, but to stand outside the doors of the theater, keeping strangers from coming in and admitting just the press. So it opened on December 26, 1973. And if you do your math right, the day before opening would have been Christmas Day. Quite a little stocking stuffer there. We had to drag the press out of the bosom of their family. And for some reason, they didn't mind it to see The Exorcist. And so I've been bedeviled by it for all this time, because not long after that, again, remember, this is Boston. My bosses and I were indicted by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for, let me get the billing right, obscenity, immorality, and blasphemy, and corrupting the morals of a minor. A crazy religious nut named Rita Warren, who lived nearby, had brought her underage daughter to see the movie, disregarding the film's R rating. And for some reason, she wasn't charged with child endangerment. We were charged with those crimes. And of course, the case was thrown out, as it turned out, on the first day of Lent. But in the meantime, William Friedkin gave me a call. I'd never met him before. He called me at the office and said, "Nat, you've got to stand up for the First Amendment. You've got to do something about these people." And we were friends for 50 years.
Oh, that's incredible. So you were there literally at the birth of this film that still to this day, every Halloween when you're looking for a list of horror movies to watch, it's always in the top 10. And it's, again, to in my opinion, in my humble estimation, still probably the most terrifying movie of all time, for a number of reasons that we can talk about in length, I'm sure. But this is a film that's based on a true story. So probably best to begin at the beginning. So based on a novel by William Peter Blatty, which is based on a true story about a young boy, actually. And if I remember correctly, was he located in Boston as well?
No, the true story, and I put quotes around the word true because I think there was some contrivance by the boy himself and by the Catholic Church. But in 1949, in Cottage City, Maryland, which is a small town near Bethesda, which doesn't help you very much, near Silver Spring. Well, I was born in Silver Spring, which was near there, and when I was not possessed, near Washington, D.C., there was a boy who was supposedly freed of demonic possession by priests. And William Peter Blatty saw an article about this in the Washington Post, and it sort of stored it away because he was a student at Georgetown University studying, probably literature and of course religious studies at a Jesuit school. And later, when he couldn't get a job writing Hollywood comedies anymore because styles had changed, he took his savings and sat down and wrote a book that scared the hell into people, literally. So it's based on a true story. And my book, The Exorcist Legacy, 50 Years of Fear, recounts the original story through an enormously successful and diligent reporter named Mark Obsaznik, who has written about the possession case. He's just an incredible shoes on the ground reporter. He was able to find out who the person really was who was supposedly possessed, and we go from there.
Oh, wow. So obviously, some debate as to the validity, the actual events themselves, and whether or not this kid was actually possessed. But still, even aside from that, quite a few, we'll say, artistic liberties, right, between the story as it was told initially and what became The Exorcist, the novel. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, nobody's head turned around. I mean, William Peter Blatty made this very clear to Billy Friedkin, that if Reagan's head had turned around, her spine would have snapped and she'd be dead. And so they inserted a cutaway. So like an owl, you're not really sure if it goes all the way around. And I mention that because Blatty says improbable doesn't mean impossible, which I think Sherlock Holmes may have said too. There are a lot of things that happened in the movie that actually happened. Now, that's my provocative opening statement. They actually happened, but they didn't happen because anybody was possessed. Because Friedkin's brilliance in making The Exorcist was to do it as if it was a documentary. So between the makeup of Dick Smith and the brilliant mechanical effects of Marcel Vercoutier, they contrived to make the bed shake and rise and Linda Blair to float and doors to crack and things to fall over because they actually happened physically in front of the camera. And this veracity gives the film a truth and a sense of immediacy that has entranced and scared people for half a century.
Yeah, it's one of the remarkable things in reading up on this over the years is just to what lengths Friedkin went to create these effects. I mean, this is long before the advent of CGI and things of that nature. I remember the scene where you can see their breath, because the room has gotten so cold. I had read a rumor about the fact that Friedkin brought in this refrigeration system just to get the room cold. Yeah.
The whole bedroom set was enclosed in a cocoon with powerful, powerful air conditioners, which of course made so much noise that they turned them off when they were going to shoot. But then the presence of the actors and the lights warmed the room up to the point where their breath no longer showed. So they had to go and cool everything down again. So they could only get about 5 or 6 shots a day. And this is why it took so long to do it. And of course, everybody on the crew is wearing down jackets, but the guys playing the priest and poor Linda Blair is sitting there under an electric blanket. But they're freezing their pills off because of this air conditioning unit, but which I think worked for the scene dramatically.
Absolutely. I mean, there are some scenes in that movie that just brilliant from an artistic standpoint, and Friedkin kind of use some other tactics that we would say probably would not be allowable today.
I know where you're going. I know where you're going.
The starter pistol. Talk about that.
Well, Irwin Allen did this too on The Towering Inferno, and some directors have done it because they want to get a startled reaction. And most people have a startled reaction when a gun goes off near them. Actors detest it. And in fact, Jason Miller was saying to Billy, don't do that again because we're actors. Billy would fire the pistol if he wanted a startled reaction from somebody. And it got to the point where the actors were so used to it that one day Max von Sydow came on the set and he asked Owen Roisman, the director of photography, "Good morning, Owen. Where did Billy hide the guns today?" I mean, this is Max was a cut-up. You wouldn't know it from his work in the Bergman film, but Max von Sydow was a very funny, very dryly funny man. And, of course, the big thing about what Billy does is he likes to hit actors. Now, let me be specific about that. Father O'Malley, William O'Malley, who was an actual priest playing Father Dyer in the film, Father Karras's best friend, it was like 2 or 3 in the morning, and he had to give the last rites to his friend who just fallen down the Exorcist steps. And he couldn't do it. And everybody, meanwhile, is very cold in Washington, D.C. They're trying to keep themselves warm, and they're not getting in the scene and not getting in the scene because, let's face it, O'Malley was not an actor. He had a day job. So what Friedkin had to do was say, "Bill, do you trust me?" Of course, O'Malley said, "Of course I trust you." And Billy said, "Okay." And he hauled off and slugged the priest. The priest was so shocked that he went into tears, which is exactly what this scene needed. And you can see now his hand is shaking when he's administering the last rites to his old friend. Billy had, of course, already turned the camera on. Then he apologized to him afterwards, which I think is nice because, Billy confessed to the priest, and the priest gave him absolution for hitting him.
That's a wild story. It's it's interesting because you can see the authenticity in the moment, the real emotion, and again, probably things you couldn't get away with today, but at that time, in that moment, they just worked.
A director's job, especially a brilliant job like William Friedkin or John Ford or people like that, is to create a situation on the set where the actors can behave like the characters. And Friedkin was a past master at that.
Yeah, it's the other thing that I want to go back to that you said a moment ago that makes a lot of sense to me now. One of the things that always has stood out to me about this film is just sort of the way that they take their time. It's not like a lot of modern horror flicks where there's just something happening every second and it rush, action. This movie, there's a lot of quiet and there's not a whole lot of background music or noise or a score or soundtrack or whatever. So it almost plays on your senses in the way that you are heightened because you're waiting for that noise or that, something to happen. So you're almost on alert the entire movie. And I always thought that was extraordinarily clever. And so when you say that they tried to film it sort of like a documentary, that makes complete sense to me now.
That's very observant. A lot of films today and a lot of television shows will have this kind of low rumbling score in the background to keep you off your balance. And then they will do essentially Mickey Mousing all the important parts. Well, if you have a good story and people know what they're doing, you don't have to do that. The Exorcist still works because the tension is there because you're waiting for something to happen. It's skillfully done, skillfully staged. You don't have the time for that in a lot of productions today, so they have to introduce music. The director, Martin Ritt, who was, besides being a friend, made films like Norma Ray and The Great White Hope, and Sounder would always say that if he did his job right as director, he shouldn't need music. Well, in his later years, he learned that music is very, very helpful to underscoring what you're trying to do. And The Exorcist did the job right, too. They used tubular bells and a few other musical cues, but they didn't need music for the rest of the time. And you're right. It had that documentary reality about it.
Yeah, I think between that technique and just the nature of the fact that when talking to a lot of my friends, they mentioned the same thing, that the element of this film that heightens the level of fear is just the notion that, in some sense, this is something that's possible, that this could happen. It's not so far out of the realm of possibility. A lot of people grew up, going to church and things like that. And so there is this sense that, oh gosh, this could happen to anybody. And
you're right. You're right. The church has brainwashed Western civilization for over 2,000 years, and other religions have done it for longer, that there is a personified devil and he's going to come and get you. So the film was able to reap those thoughts which have been in people's minds for such a long time.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that, because when this film came out, there was an interesting reaction from specifically the Catholic Church.
Well, it's company policy. I mean, that's what The Exorcist is. In fact, I would argue that William Friedkin and William Peter Blatty made a more religious film than anything Cecil B. DeMille ever did. They're talking about a personified devil, and this is what Bill Blatty was trying to do with his so-called trilogy of faith: The Exorcist, Legion, which he made as a film as Exorcist 3, and then the Ninth Configuration. And that is, he said, once he found this story and he started writing it, he said, if he could prove that there was a devil, then perhaps there was a God and angels and a life everlasting. And that's what he did, he tried to do it. Now, Friedkin fought him somewhat, saying he wasn't making a commercial for the Catholic Church. But in fact, it is an incredibly religious film. And the more you believe, and in some cases, the more you fear, the more the film works.
Yeah, that's very true. Talk a little bit about, though, the kind of dynamic between Blatty and Friedkin, because it does seem at some points that they didn't necessarily have the same vision for what the film would become.
I have to tell you that before I'll tell you this, and that is back in the 60s, William Friedkin was the flavor of the month after he'd arrived and won some awards for documentaries. And Blake Edwards, the great writer, producer, director, wanted Friedkin to direct the feature film version of Peter Gunn, which was a television series that was very popular. He sent Billy the script, and Billy sent it back saying, this is the worst piece of crap I've ever read. And he told that to Blake Edwards in his office. And Blake Edwards said, well, perhaps you'd like to meet the writer. He's sitting right outside. And the writer was William Peter Blatty, who came in the room. Edwards said, okay, tell the writer what you told me. And Friedkin said to Blatty's face, it's the worst piece of crap I've ever read. And Blatty laughed and said, you're right, and nobody here has had the guts to tell me that.
Wow.
So Blake Edwards made Peter Gunn, and it was a bad movie. But Friedkin kept Blatty's affection. And so when Billy had made the French Connection, Blatty sent Billy the manuscript for The Exorcist, for the book. And Friedkin says, I want to do this. So Blatty was in Friedkin's corner all along. When it came to make the film, Blatty had turned in a script which was all full of flashbacks and flash forwards and dissolves and special effects. And Friedkin said to Blatty, your script is no good. Write your book, which he did. And of course, wound up winning the Oscar for it. And then Friedkin and Blatty had perfect mind meld until the last part of the film. Now, there's 16,000 different points of view about that. But Friedkin showed the version of the film to Blatty, and they both liked it. They liked it very much. But then Billy wanted to shorten it. He took some scenes out that he thought were redundant. And the most important scene was a scene on the stairwell. And I hope anybody who's watching this has seen the movie recently enough to remember this. Between Fathers Karras and Marin, in between exorcisms. And Father Karras says, why is this happening? Why is the demon doing this? And Father Marin says, quite sincerely, because the demon wants us to be revolted. He wants us to see how horrible mankind is and to ask ourselves, how can God possibly love any human being who can be as vile as this? Well, Friedkin took that out. It was only about a 1-minute scene, but it bothered Blatty. And it bothered him for decades until Billy put it back into a new director's cut of the film, which is on the new 4K, which has been released on DVD and which is being shown in theaters to celebrate the anniversary of The Exorcist. They wanted to make it more on the nose. That was, Blatty said, his purpose of writing it. Billy thought it was redundant. So they had a bit of distance between them, but they wound up being very close at the end.
Oh, that's interesting. One of the other things that I found fascinating, just in terms of the preparation for making the movie, was some of the disagreements, or maybe not even disagreements, but sort of kind of push and pull when it came to casting. What I found most fascinating is, thinking from today's perspective, first of all, you don't see a lot of big name directors taking on a horror film to begin with. And then secondly, you don't see a lot of typically a ton of A-list actors, taking roles in horror films. But at the time, there were a lot of huge names that were up for potentially being in this movie, which I thought was interesting. I saw names like Marlon Brando and Paul Newman and things of this sort. But then Friedkin decided he'd rather go with lesser known actors. Talk about that a little. I thought that was really interesting.
Well, as far as an A-list director, remember, he just won the Oscar for The French Connection, taking on a horror film. You got to remember, as much as you and other people think that The Exorcist is a horror film, the people who made it didn't call it a horror film. They said it's a mystery, a murder mystery, a supernatural murder mystery, because that's really what the plot is all about. Who killed the movie director? And yet, Billy, I guess, wanted to be the star of his own film. He wanted to have faces you hadn't seen before, so you wouldn't bring the baggage of a Paul Newman or a Marlon Brando in with you. I mean, Jane Fonda was offered the role, and she passed by saying she didn't want to do capitalist bullshit. But Ellen Burstyn did it, and not only, I believe, got an Oscar nomination, but proves herself. I mean, she was very gracious to speak to me for the book. Probably our finest living American actress of her generation. The work that she's done is just incalculable. And she also pulled a special stunt when it comes to the new Exorcist film, which we may be able to talk about later. But you wanted people that you could believe in, not people who you'd think of the other movies they'd made. And that's important when you're making a film as outlandish as The Exorcist really is.
Yeah, it was really sort of the first of its kind at that point. Now, obviously, as you referenced, there's been multiple iterations since then, and knockoffs and what have you. And Blumhouse, more recently, is preparing to. They've bought the rights to that franchise and that property, and are preparing to release a new version, starring with Ellen Burstyn in it, which I thought was very cool. Coming out, I believe, this October,
October 6th.
Excellent. Oh, very soon.
They moved it up a week.
Okay, yeah, that's very exciting. I'll be honest, though, a lot of the iterations that they made, 10, 20 years ago, kind of the first sequels after the initial sequels were made, just sort of fell short, I felt. It kind of paled in comparison. You're
being nice.
Yes.
If there is a curse to The Exorcist, it's that any other Exorcist movie made after the first one hasn't done well. Yes. Of course, Exorcist 2 is kind of the Fight Club of horror movies. Yes. The first rule of Exorcist 2 is there was no Exorcist 2.
Yes.
And then bad. When it was well, we go into that in The Exorcist Legacy, because they didn't start out being bad, and I don't want to talk about it any more than I have to. But it's one of these movies where, as one exhibitor said, there should be two lines, one to sell the tickets and a second line to give refunds on the tickets. It just didn't fly. Bill Blatty made Exorcist 3, which was based on his novel Legion, and that has one of the greatest shocks in movie history, which I will not give away here. And it's a much more philosophical film. And for that film, he sold the rights to his book to Morgan Creek Productions. And since then, Morgan Creek has made the two prequels to The Exorcist. They allowed Bill to recut Exorcist 3. They also are involved with Blumhouse and Universal in these new threequels of The Exorcist. So they put their money where their mouth is, and they've done an awful lot, folks at Morgan Creek, to shore up when they thought the films didn't work. They ordered reshooting. I mean, it was an enormous amount of expense, and they're really strongly behind it. So I can only hope it goes well. But the other films have not been as successful as the first one, because I think the first one came along at a time when it was just the right moment. It also has much more humanity in it than any of the other films has. And again, the other films have special effects, but The Exorcist really doesn't. And there's something about honesty that seduces an audience.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. And I think, considering the fact that all these other things were sort of happening around that time, you have the height of sort of almost like the height of serial killers at that point. So, people in society are sort of on edge to begin with, and then you have this film where literally you have reports of people passing out in the theater and yeah. So talk about that, because I don't know that we've seen anything like that since then.
When we saw the film the day before opening, we didn't know we were supposed to throw up. But apparently, after that, we had people just running from the auditorium and hoping they make it to the street outside before they let go of the Technicolor yawn. Some of the managers all over the country reported this. It opened in 22 theaters. And, how does the audience know? A, how do they know there's a hit? And B, how do they know they're supposed to puke? But somewhere along the line, this got to them. And in fact, Warner Brothers did a very informal survey. And this may surprise you. Of course, you've read The Exorcist Legacy, so it won't surprise you. The people who were more apt to get sick would do so not in the possession scenes, but in the hospital scene where Reagan is having this arteriogram, a legitimate medical procedure done, and there's some blood that's spurting. And again, the accuracy of it is so anatomically correct that it made people sick. And the people who fled from the theater, and this is something that destroys my own pride, tended to be largely men. Women could take it. The explanation that was offered at the time was women are mothers, and if they can go through the pain of childbirth, they could certainly watch a horror movie. But that was what happened. It surprised everybody at Warner Brothers, mostly men. And that's the legacy of The Exorcist. And then, of course, the people waiting in line to see the next show would watch people coming out ashen from the previous show, and they'd, like waiting to go onto a roller coaster ride, be hyped up to see it as well. It became an actual phenomenon.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I mean, like I said, I don't know that we've seen anything, at least to that extreme anyway, happen since then. And talk about going viral before going viral was a thing. Right. What better marketing can you get?
I know, the movie that makes you puke. I mean, how did people know these things? How did people know who to vote for? How did people avoid all advertising? What did Sam Goldwyn say? If people don't want to see a film, nothing can keep them away. They stayed away in droves. Who knows how it works? If we could bottle that, we'd have successes.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that I definitely want to talk about is we talked a little bit about some of the adult actors that really brought this film home. From the actors who played the priest to the actor who played the mother, Ellen Burstyn, and such incredible veteran actors. Max van Sydow, obviously, probably being aside from Burstyn the most well known in that film. But really, this film could not have been as good as it was without casting the character of Reagan correctly. And that poor woman now in her probably 50s or 60s, she took a beating while making this film.
Yeah, she did. That's why she didn't want to wear the makeup for Heretic Exorcist 2. It took several hours to make up Linda Blair, who was an extraordinarily bright, personable, and very centered, very psychologically normal young woman. In fact, Ellen Burstyn kind of adopted her, although Linda's mother was there too. And Billy treated her like a father. I mean, they all treated her very well. There were rumors going around that she'd become possessed in the making of the film. Well, if you've ever been on a film set, William Goldman said the most exciting day of your life is your first day on a film set, and the most boring day of your life is your second day on a film set. It takes so long to do everything. So it was mostly waiting between scenes, between setups. And Linda was not possessed. She was, if anything, coddled and catered to and rehearsed. But she managed to hold up very, very well, because it's just plain old boring. And she couldn't run around the room, remember. She was the one who was stuck in the bed. So she has emerged as a remarkable woman who has opened a charity that helps rescue and help pets, animals in need. And that's about as blessed as anything you could imagine.
Absolutely. And again, her performance in this film is just absolutely remarkable. I mean, the things that they had to put her through. One of the things that comes to mind is the scene where her body is kind of like flipping backward and forward, very violently. As you said, there were no special effects in this film. They actually had to physically do that. And to my knowledge, she still has back pain to this day. She had some lasting effects from that.
Yes. The device that Vercoutier built to flop her up and down, they had formed a body cast that would hold her securely, but the straps came off at one point. And so in the movie, when she's being flipped up and down, she's screaming for it to stop. She really is screaming for it to stop.
Wow, that's absolutely incredible. And again, it comes out in film. They probably didn't necessarily intend on an actual reaction, but they certainly got one, and it plays out in the film. It's, again, to this day, in my mind, the most frightening film of all time. And again, I think it goes back to the nature of that sort of documentary feel, and the fact that there are more quiet moments in that movie than there are loud action. We all think of those scenes with the throwing up pea soup and the head spinning around and the body flopping back and forth and the crucifix scene and all those things. But I think if you go back, there are more scenes where nothing is really happening. They're building the story, but there's nothing spectacular happening necessarily.
You have to believe. There are 4 stories that wind their way through The Exorcist. One of them, of course, is who killed Burt Dennings, and that's the one that Detective Kinderman is finding out. You've also got a priest, Father Merrin, who is coming to face with an old enemy. You have a priest who's lost his faith, Father Karras, who in the end does the most remarkable and holiest thing he can do. He sacrifices his life for someone he's never met. And then you've got the most overriding story, which is the story of a mother going to any lengths possible to protect her child. You don't have these in the other movies. You really don't. And if you have even parts of them, you don't have the earnestness with which these fine actors and the great writing and the great directing pulled off.
That's a very good point. Thinking back to the other sequels and even some of the films that have kind of paid tribute to the original Exorcist, they sort of really heavily lean on the possessed scenes, where they're speaking and in a voice that sounds like 10 octaves lower and saying repulsive things, but really beyond that, that's really sort of for shock value, but they really kind of fall short when it comes to the actual story itself.
Yeah, screenwriters and dramatists know there's 2 things about a story. There's the plot and there's the subplot. The plot is what happens. The subplot is what the story's about. The plot of The Exorcist, everybody knows. A little girl is possessed and she's freed of demons. But what the story is about protecting the child. It's about loss of faith. It's about reestablishing your faith. And that's why it has such resonances. And that's why what I tried to write about in The Exorcist Legacy and what I think people take away from the film, that you know who these people are.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the legacy of the film. Obviously, like we've talked about, it did result in, because any major studio that's going to have a hit on their hands like that, you can guarantee a sequel is coming. And we know the initial sequel fell widely short. Exorcist 3, I thought was very good. I think as a standalone film, I enjoyed it quite a bit. Mostly Bradley Dourif's part in it, but then since then, some of the sequels were okay. Yeah.
Although the problem in doing a prequel is everybody knows how it comes out, and you can't kill Merrin, you can't put people in jeopardy. First, Paul Schrader tried it with a wonderful script by William Wisher, and the company didn't like it, so they hired Rennie Harlan to reshoot most of it, turning it into a film where the camera acts like a housefly going all over the place. Schrader is, no question about it, very, very smart, and also has a great religious background. And so you can say, and I'm being glib about this, Paul Schrader made a film, but Rennie Harlan made a movie. And the 2 prequels are like that. There's a lot of thought in each of them. I think that Dominion, which is Paul Schrader's film, has a lot more in it. But the thing about an Exorcist film is if you make an Exorcist film, you've got to have an exorcism. And Schrader's problem was that it's about a boy who is very, very sick. And as he becomes possessed, he gets healthy. Well, that's not interesting. What's interesting is someone who starts off healthy like Reagan and then becomes unhealthy when she's possessed. And so right away you have a problem. And they try to work around that by adding other things, other resonances that should have worked. But unfortunately, they simply didn't. It's just one of those things. But then Morgan Creek came along and threw millions more to try to make it work. So I got to hand it to them too.
Yeah, and what's interesting, I don't I don't know a lot about this the sequel that's coming very, very soon, October 6th, I think you said. And other than the fact that there are not one but two possessed young ladies in this film, so are they just doubling down like twice the power, I guess, with two victims per se?
I don't know. I haven't seen the film. I wish it will. David Gordon Green, who's a co-writer and the director, was very, very gracious in giving me an interview about the film for the book a year and a half before the film came out. He probably shouldn't have been speaking to anybody, but he was really smart, and very kind in speaking to me. And that's verbatim in The Exorcist Legacy. Also, Ellen Burstyn, of course, did a wonderful thing. She felt confident in what David was doing, and she agreed after some hesitation to be in the film. And of course, what she did was, in a sense, what Father Karras did, was she managed to get them to pay her so much money to be in the movie that she gave the money to the Actors Studio, where she's one of the directors, to set up a graduate program for future actors. Now, is that generous or what?
That's awesome. That's really cool. Well, and I think it's kind of a testament to what Blumhouse has been able to do with some other franchises, where I think, you can see like Jamie Lee Curtis came back for the Halloween movies. And so there is some precedent to suggest that they've had a lot of success with some of these classic franchises, and that, it's a good risk to take, I guess, for her.
Yeah. Jason Blum is very smart. He's got his genre selected, and he has depth of knowledge in the whole thing. So I wish them well. I think they're trying to branch out now into other areas, which, is always dangerous, but they certainly have the credentials to keep on with the horror and frightening genre. And I hope they do, because he's no fool. He knows what he's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So what other things were kind of surprised you? Obviously, there's a great amount of research that went into your book. Were there some things that you found particularly surprising as you were researching the film that maybe you didn't even know way back when?
Well, I got asked that question a lot. And the point about research is you're not surprised a lot. I've even tried to contrive an answer. But I think the thing that, if anything, surprised me the most was coming from William Peter Blatty, and how devout he was, and how he really believed in this. And how, although he wasn't a cultist, he certainly believed in afterlife and in spirits. And it's this sincerity, I think, that I wasn't really prepared for, but I was able to study. I've talked later to his firstborn son, Mike, who has just been a total friend now. And Blatty becomes richer to me the more I hear about him. He also gave me a hell of an interview when I was writing the biography of William Friedkin, which came out in 1990 and was called Hurricane Billy. He took a lot of it off the record at the time, but years have passed since then, and I was able to put it back on the record, where he really talks about his life and his doubts and what he was trying to do with all these properties. So I think I wasn't really surprised, but I came to appreciate Blatty so much more.
Oh, that's interesting. You talked a little bit about sort of the goal between those two men in making this film, not necessarily being to make a frightening horror film, as it were, but they had a slightly different goal in mind.
Well, Friedkin wanted to make a film that was true to its soul, and Blatty, I think, was trying to convey a message. I think it's one of these things where the right forces have brought people together at the right time, and it worked. But I don't know anything more profound. In Hollywood, you make the movies that they let you make. And the film that Billy made after that was Sorcerer, which took 40 years to come into prominence, which many of us loved at the time, but it damn near killed his career because it lost so much money. And yet it may be his best film. But think about somebody who made The French Connection, The Exorcist, and Sorcerer all right in a row. Talk about a legacy. So that's Billy's legacy.
Oh, that's incredible. So one last question for you. What do you want people to take away from this book on the 50th anniversary, right before a new version, some new blood in the franchise comes out?
Well, I'll tell you what I found, and it's from two different types of reviews that I've read. Having been a critic for 20 years, I try not to read reviews, but these two stood out to me. One of the reviews said, "It's more than you'll ever want to know about the Exorcist films." And the other one said, "For those of you who know the Exorcist films, you'll already know it." So whatever it is, I think this may answer the question so we can move on. I hope people buy the book. I hope they keep it on their shelf. And I hope they use it to better understand the movies as they see them again on video.
Thanks for listening to this week's mystery. If you like this episode or any of the prior episodes, consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing so you don't miss a single new episode. And consider sharing with a friend. Next week, we'll be back with a brand new mystery. And until then, you've been listening to From the Void.